I'm Dan Kurtz-Phelan, and this is the Foreign Affairs Interview.
How could you get this so wrong? How could you end up in a position where you're giving away the store to the Iranians in a memorandum of understanding? I mean, no one can read that memo and say, "Oh, this has gone well for Trump." It's implausible to spin in a favorable way.
The war in Iran may have come to an end, but both the course and the conclusion of that war have brought into sharp relief the forces that increasingly define a world of weaponized power and systemic risk. Unconstrained leaders willing to gamble with military force, the search for and use of economic leverage, technologies destabilizing both decision-making and development models, old alliances fracturing and new alignments forming. Ian Bremmer is a leading geopolitical analyst and the president and founder of the Eurasia Group. His most recent piece for Foreign Affairs is about the long-term consequences of the Iran war, but he's also written on shifts in global power, on the impact of technology on geopolitics, and much else. We spoke on Monday, June 22nd, about how to make sense of today's global turmoil. Ian, great to have you back on the podcast. There's a lot to talk about, beginning with Iran and the Middle East, the topic of your most recent Foreign Affairs essay, but a lot more besides that.
Dan, I always love hanging out with you, man.
Well, let me start with a very simple question. In your recent Foreign Affairs piece, you call this war in Iran and the outcome Trump's greatest foreign policy failure. Why is that, just in simple terms?
Because he was unable to achieve any of his direct war aims, because he wildly miscalculated that the hit that the Iranians took would force them to capitulate, and that the costs and the consequences for Trump with allies in the region and economically, those costs are all pretty significant. The relevant analogy for Trump, I mean, the second biggest failure would have been China and his effort in the context of Liberation Day to force the weaker Chinese economy, smaller Chinese economy to capitulate, and also failing. The Chinese hit back and Trump had to back down. But the economic consequences and the geopolitical consequences and the domestic political consequences for Trump were much smaller in the context of US-China relations than what I see happening with Iran, where so many people, including, as of this last couple of days, 92% of Israelis surveyed believe that this war is a failure, believe that they lost. And I don't know if I'd go that far. I think it's more of a climb down, and it's hard to say the Iranians won when they've, had their leadership assassinated and so much of their military and economic infrastructure damaged. But certainly they were able to, like Cape Verde, play much larger adversaries to a draw. And I think that surprise for Trump, and I think a surprise for almost all of his supporters, like how could you get this so wrong? How could you end up in a position where you're giving away the store to the Iranians in a memorandum of understanding? I mean, no one can read that memo and say, "Oh, this has gone well for Trump." It's implausible to spin in a favorable way.
Yeah, and as you walk through the various goals that Trump and senior administration officials laid out early on, whether it's on nuclear program or missiles or Iranian proxies in the region or Iranian regime change, to mention the most expansive one, they got almost nothing on any of those and are in similar or worse shape to where they were before the war. I think it's fair to say.
Yeah. And arguably, the Iranians are in a stronger position, at least in the near term. I would not want to be them in terms of their domestic politics in, say, 3 years' time. But then again, that's also true of the status quo ante. And I certainly don't believe that they'll be able to maintain this level of leverage over the strait for a long period of time. But nonetheless, if you look at where the Iranians were before the Americans launched the war with Israel and where they are today, I mean, clearly they've shown they can take a punch and they can hit back. And the very fact that President Trump said that he had to end the blockade or the world would face economic catastrophe, and that he did not want to become another President Hoover. Think about that. He's saying that the Iranians had the capacity to make him into Hoover. The Iranians had the capacity to cause that economic catastrophe if he had not stepped back from the brink. That's an extraordinary statement. And it's very similar to the Chinese having the capacity to shut down American factories by using their critical minerals, their rare earths, in a way that Trump and his cabinet members had not anticipated.
Let me ask you to engage in a bit of prognostication here, which is slightly dangerous when it comes to anything related to Trump. Do you expect the ceasefire to hold? And as you look at the negotiations that have just recently started with J.D. Vance and Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner leading the American side, do you see any potential for real progress on nuclear agreement or anything else? Or do you imagine we're in a kind of slightly ambiguous state on all of those, a kind of purgatory that will persist indefinitely?
So the first question is a lot easier than the second. Do I expect the ceasefire to hold? Yes, I do. And I expect it to hold because over the past couple months, despite repeated threats and very expansive threats by Trump, we're going to destroy your regime, we're going to end your civilization, we're going to hit your critical infrastructure, he has every time backed away. And the only time that he engaged in military strikes since the ceasefire of any consequence were directly after the Iranians had knocked a U.S. helicopter out of the sky, when it was clear that that response was small, it was calibrated, it allowed the Americans, it allowed Trump to say, you see, I've got this military capability, but we know it's not going to lead to untethered escalation. So, I mean, really, it's the exception that proves the rule. He does not want to get into another fight with this country. And given that, the fundamental agreement that we have in the memorandum, which is ceasefire that holds and get the strait open, are things that Trump wants to see persist. Now, of course, in the first paragraph, what we also see, and you know what I'm going to say, is that Lebanon is a part of this deal, and they've just set up a deconfliction agreement, a mechanism in Switzerland with the Lebanese, the Qataris, the Pakistanis, the US, and Iran, everyone you would want to ensure deconfliction, except Israel, which is actually in the fight with Lebanon, with Hezbollah, and except Hezbollah, which is in the fight with Israel. At least with Hezbollah, the Iranians have some level of direct control over military decisions they make. In the case of Israel, no one has direct control over what the Israelis do. The Americans have influence, not direct control. And the U.S. certainly doesn't have jurisdiction over Israeli strikes into Lebanon and Israeli occupation in the south of Lebanon, which will persist. So I do think it's plausible. In fact, I think it's very likely that that fight is going to flare up again. And the question is how big, and on the back of that, might Iran and the United States fight again? I think the U.S. will be very reluctant to join that fight. And I think the Iranians will complain, and it will lead them to extend and pretend well beyond the 60 days on the nuclear file. But it's unlikely to lead to another round of all-out war. So I feel reasonably confident, as confident as I think one can feel about these sorts of things, that the ceasefire will hold, that the strait will reopen, that oil prices will come down. I do not feel anywhere close to as confident that there will be meaningful progress on the nuclear deal, not only because the Israelis can stop it from happening, and that means that the Iranians, by using their influence over Hezbollah, can get the Israelis to stop it from happening, right? I mean, the bank shot, if you will, but also because Iran can negotiate with other countries. I mean, right now, the principal difference between this deal and the JCPOA, the Obama deal, is not just in how limited the MOU has as coverage, but also the fact that the MOU is a unilateral deal between the US and Iran. And yet there are many, many countries in the region and in the world that have various interests to ensure that this war does not restart, that the strait remains open. And they have been negotiating with the Iranians, and they will continue. And so I think that a lot of the action going forward, that in terms of Iranian diplomacy, will be via Oman and Qatar, with the Saudis, with other countries in the region. Kuwait, for example, will also be with the Europeans, with the Indians, with the Chinese. And that will lead to more money for Iran, but it won't lead to a broader nuclear deal between the Iranians and the Americans, especially because the Iranians, to give up anything, they're going to want maximum sanction relief. And the Americans will be reluctant to provide that unless they get full agreement on the disposition of all of the enriched uranium stockpiles and inspections preventing them from enrichment at higher than civilian levels going forward. We know how hard it was for Obama to get that with a limited time frame. And I think that it would be much harder for Trump to accomplish that. It would be harder given who Trump has running the file, harder given the lack of trust for Trump administration that engaged in decapitation strikes with Israel in the middle of negotiations, and harder because the Iranians feel like they have alternatives. So I'm pretty low confidence that we're going to end up with an agreement. And I thought it was very interesting that, yes, J.D. Vance is taking responsibility, if you will, for the overall contours of the negotiations. But when he was asked about Lebanon and Israel, he said, "Wow, that's Jared and Steve." Well, so very obviously, I think Vance is smartly, for his own political future, pivoting to a more MAGA position on ending wars, not Israel first, America first, which Trump is perfectly aligned with, or he wouldn't be saying it. But he's like, the tough stuff that's likely to break apart this deal, he's saying, hey, that's not me. That's Jared and Steve. And I'm sure they'll do a wonderful job. Wink, wink. And when they don't look at me, because they're the ones that are responsible here. This is their expertise. They're the Abraham Accord guys. They're the Gaza guys. I just came in because I outranked them, right? If I were advising Vance right now, I think he's played a challenging hand surprisingly well in the first few days.
When it comes to his own political interests above all.
Yes.
You've talked about the strait being open. That, of course, is the main driver of this agreement from the Trump administration's perspective. You can also see lots of actors, I think, including the United States, defining openness down, right? That this is not about going back necessarily to the way the strait was open before the war started, but allowing extraction of fees by the Iranians and maybe the Omanis. You hear lots of regional officials saying, off the record or on background, that they're more or less willing to pay because they don't really see an alternative. Do you expect that something that a normal person would call tolling will persist after the 60 days covered by the MOU are over?
Insurance, environmental fees, management fees, some form of investment into reconstruction on the ground Iran. I think there are many ways to skin that cat. But I also think, and this is an important point, when you use the leverage, it becomes a diminishing asset. And people are not talking about this. Again, same with China. China has taken, for decades, they had built up a monopoly position on critical minerals and rare earths. So they've had it. And the Americans weren't investing, the Europeans weren't investing, the Japanese, the Australians, underinvestment because it's inexpensive. The Chinese are doing it at scale. If it's not broken, why fix it? And then the Chinese show all of a sudden, no. We've got a licensing regime. We can shut you down if you don't behave the way we want. And immediately, countries all over the world say, oh my God, that's unacceptable. We need to invest as fast as possible at scale in building alternatives, which they will do. And within a period, in some cases, and with critical minerals, within a matter of 12, 24 months, with the heavy rare earths, it might be more like 5 to 7 years. But China's ability to act in a predatory way, given monopoly leverage, that clock is ticking right now, and their pricing power diminishes in an ongoing way because they used the leverage. And that's exactly what Iran did. Now, Iran did it under a position of far greater threat, right? I mean, basically, you kill their leadership. You talk about regime change, they break glass, they pull emergency lever. And that lever is the strait that they have always had the geography to impact in terms of mines, for example. And they've built up significant drone capabilities and ballistics. So they use it. And immediately after they use it, the Emiratis start building a new pipeline over land. And in the region, you have all sorts of additional infrastructure for rail and for trucking that gets built. And all over the world, countries say we can't be as reliant on the strait. And we don't want to be as reliant on the stuff that comes through the strait. So you see a move to push for, sustainable energy and for more coal for that matter. But anything that is not about oil and gas and LNG and helium and petrochems that come through the strait. I mean, I joked the other day, but I think it's true that looking back on this in 5-10 years, we might see that President Trump has become the US president that has done the most to actually foster and support a transition to green energy than any other president because of the second order impact of an Iran war shutting down the strait. Now, that wasn't his intention, but that is the reality. Look at the demand for electric vehicles right now. Look at the demand for battery technology right now, the smart grid, because everyone understands that what you do in the Strait of Hormuz, the Houthis could potentially do in the Red Sea. And I mean, heck, the Taiwanese or anyone else could potentially do, again, under threat, under duress, in Malacca. And so all of this is to say that the Iranians, having been forced in this horrible position, do I think that they have won long term? I think that they're going to have a diminishing asset, and they won't have the same pricing power even in a year that they have right now. And it's important for all of us to recognize that.
It is notable as you talk about the boom in green energy and clean technology that's likely to come from this is already starting, that will give the Chinese a new chokehold, a new choke point in some sense, even as they lose the rare earth dominance. That should be quite good for Chinese EVs and Chinese battery technology and solar panels and everything else.
Chinese, you're so right, Dan. The Chinese are in pole position globally in terms of their investing at scale in the technologies that are world-class in sustainable energy. And yet, despite everything that Trump has done to reduce the interest, certainly in wind power, but also in the margins of solar, the incredible voracious appetite for the hyperscalers in AI and the data centers that they are building, that we've never seen an infrastructure build out at this scale with this money, that means you need far more sustainable energy. And so we're seeing that build out come in the United States too. I wish it wasn't coming with the Chinese having such a lead, having built up such a lead, and the Americans having occasionally shot itself in the foot politically, including at the beginning of the Trump administration. But ultimately, I think everyone's going to get this joke. And so, yes, it's advantageous to the Chinese in the near term, but in reality, 8 billion people on the planet benefit from learning that we need to move faster at scale away from oil and gas, away from fossil fuels, because the pricing of those technologies are not coming down. They're 20th century technologies. This isn't the way that the world is going to move towards artificial general intelligence. You can't do it with oil and gas. It won't work globally.
Accepting your point about control of the strait being a wasting asset for the Iranians, it still does seem quite remarkable that you will have, at least for some period of time, a situation where both Iran and perhaps Oman as well will be extracting some kind of fees from their geographic position. And, as you noted, you can imagine that starting to happen in lots of other places. The Indonesian finance minister kind of joked about doing in the Strait of Malacca, then walked it back. But you can imagine if you're sitting in a similarly advantageous geographic position. That has to be on your mind if you're a senior government official. How consequential a change is that likely to be for global commerce and for the way the really international system works?
So broadly, I think that we have now seen, since the G0 world, if you will. Like, I mean, if pre G0, there was a general Washington consensus, we're winning, EU expands, NATO expands, but everyone aligns with us eventually. Russia, China, you name it, right? G7 plus one, China, sort of becomes more free market and eventually even more politically open. And if that's the world we're in, then you don't need you and me talking about this stuff. And you should be investing maximally for just in time globalization. Damn the political consequences. And we've now seen in a number of occasions where that has turned out to be a really penny wise, pound foolish approach to investment. We've seen it with semiconductors being monopolized by Taiwan just 100 miles off of mainland China, a choke point that is far too geopolitically vulnerable to persist. We've seen it with the Europeans getting so much of their oil and gas from Russia, very cheap, very easy. But when they invade Ukraine, suddenly you realize that politically this is an unacceptable hold that they have over you. You've seen it with critical minerals in China and rare earths, and now you've seen it with Hormuz and oil and gas and helium and petrochem and LNG. So for all of those reasons, a G0 world implies that you need more decentralization of investments, less just in time, more resilience, more political alignment, more industrial policy, more subsidies, more nationalism. But also, let's face it, some of this is because labor is also becoming less important. And that's an economic driver. It's not everything that you and I have been talking about, Dan, has been a political driver or a geopolitical driver. Domestic politics, international politics. But it's also true that part of the reason that you so desperately wanted the Chinese integrated into the global economy is because they had incredible amounts of relatively low-cost labor that everyone could benefit from in terms of manufacturing. India, same thing in terms of services, professional services, call centers, you name it, finance, back offices. Suddenly, with the advent first of robotics and then of AI happening faster and faster, and the fact that labor costs have gotten much more expensive in China as we've seen more outsourcing and globalization, why would you want to expose that level of manufacturing and services to something halfway around the world that can be distressed or disrupted in so many ways? I mean, I was talking to a CEO of a pretty big bank last week who is planning on removing 12,000 people from India, in part because you have to continually replace them because it's a very competitive market and they frequently can find better gigs. And so it's just hard. But in part because there's a security risk in having that level of your human capital outside of your borders if you can have something just as good about the same cost using AI with data that's held in a secure cloud or in your own country. So, I mean, that's changing. So I see a lot of ways where peak globalization is really, really fragmenting and really shifting back. And it's nationalism, it's geopolitics of G0, it's changing economic environment given shifting costs, rebalancing, and it's technology and AI. All of those things are changing how we think about globalization.
There's a lot to unpack there, but let me linger on the Middle East for a moment. One of the things you and your colleague Firas Baksa do in the Foreign Affairs piece is trace the ways that the Middle Eastern order is likely to change following the war as a result of the U.S. no longer being what you call the indispensable broker of regional stability, which is a way of applying your G0 concept to the Middle East after this war. You see kind of two factions emerging that are reacting to the regional dynamics differently. How do you see that dynamic playing out over time if you look at what you call the Abrahamic faction and then the the Islamic faction, I believe, is the other one.
Yeah, I see the Middle East as kind of ground zero for the G0 because the consequences are so existential of this US-led Iran war for everyone there, in a way that Europe could have been if Russia-Ukraine felt existential for everyone, but it doesn't, right? It's a big deal, but the Ukrainians are kind of pushing back, and the frontline states feel it's existential, but the rest of them are like, not such a big deal. NATO feels strong enough. But suddenly, the US war with Israel into Iran suddenly created these huge vulnerabilities for all of these countries in the region, and their reactions have been very, very different. So, yeah, two different coalitions that are growing, accelerating dramatically, even though you saw the seeds of these coalitions being, sort of bearing some shoots before the war started. On the one hand, Saudi Arabia with Pakistan, Turkey, and Egypt. Pakistan, a clear ally of the Saudis now. That really started after the Israelis hit Qatar, but has sped up. You got 13,000 troops on the ground in Pakistan. You've got direct air force in Saudi Arabia from Pakistan. And of course, you've got more informally a nuclear umbrella. This is Saudi Arabia saying, we know that we need that military support. We're not sure how much we can ultimately count on the Americans. We need it from Pakistan. And it's really a regional, Saudi Arabia acting as the regional anchor. Egypt, Turkey, these are regional, large Muslim states. They have Arab Street, sensibilities in terms of support for a two-state Palestinian solution, in terms of real problems with the Israelis being where they are right now, vis-a-vis the Palestinians in the West Bank, vis-a-vis Lebanon, as well as vis-a-vis Iran. And I would say that these are countries that are much more willing to hedge with China over time. Certainly Pakistan has that in spades, and for a long time they have, but also the Saudis, whose missile program comes from China, because the Americans aren't going to provide them with Tomahawks. And the Saudis also understand that if the Democrats were to come after Trump, yeah, they've got a great relationship, transactional with Jared and company, billions and billions of dollars, but things could look very different with a President AOC, for example, or someone like that, where those policies might potentially go over time. So their willingness to hedge, and the fact that they are the clear leaders of OPEC, and they're producing lots of oil against the Americans, who are controlling Venezuelan output. They've got Guyana, and they're the largest producers in the world. That makes them much more competitive. The Abrahamic coalition, UAE, Israel, and the Emirati leaders saying that they count on Israel far more today, given the Iran war. They saw who their friends are, helping them, defending them, and fighting with them against Iran. And the UAE unilaterally withdrawing from OPEC because they see their own oil as a wasting resource, given the second order effects on everyone else moving away from oil and gas faster. They want to pump in a relatively higher price environment. They want to maximize that export, but they're not really a regional player. They're not really a Muslim state. They're 1 million Emiratis. They're 10 million people that live there. They're really a family-run conglomerate. They're a city-state. They're a global node. And that they have a lot more in common with Israel and with Singapore than they do with the Saudis, than they do certainly with Pakistan or Turkey or Egypt. And they, of course, they need globalization. They need to make sure that Iran can't threaten them. And they're not going to do a deal with the Iranians in the way that I think the Saudis will, maybe facilitated by Pakistan and China. I think that the Emiratis are much more likely to support a mowing the grass strategy with the Israelis going forward if the Americans are incapable of getting to a 60-day resolution on the nuclear file, as I believe they will be. And what we're seeing today in the Middle East, with much more consequential hedging of the Americans, much more lasting geopolitical moves to ensure stability that goes beyond an American umbrella, not a willingness to act as a satellite or just the junior partner because they know it's too vulnerable. I think those things will happen in Europe. Those things will happen in Asia as the G0 becomes more obvious for those countries.
We'll return to my conversation with Ian Bremmer after a short break. One of the most surprising effects in some ways is the ways this could reshape the US-Israel relationship. We ran a piece early in the war by Dana Stroul, who had been a Pentagon official working on Middle East issues, warning that the fact of the US-Israel fighting together really for the first time in this kind of war was going to be pretty consequential and, in her view, damaging to the US-Israel relationship. It does seem like that may be true, just given the kind of rhetoric you saw from Vice President Vance from the podium at the White House a few days ago, tensions over Lebanon, as you were noting earlier. Do you see this as a kind of inflection point for US-Israel as you project forward?
Not yet. I don't. Few things. First of all, on the technology side, right? I mean, the fact is that the Israelis, the Americans, and increasingly the Emiratis are very, very integrated with American military, industrial, technology companies. The Palantirs, the Andurils, Scale AI, all of these guys. I mean, this capability is cutting edge. It is fast moving, and Israel they've made a complete bet, and there's a lot of money involved in it. So it's consequential. I also think that it's real that the Americans continue to provide billions and billions to the Israelis every year. And while I saw Rahm Emanuel saying we still want to be allies, but we don't need to pay them because they're an advanced industrial economy, they can afford it. And Rahm, it's easier for him to say that as a Jew than it would be, when AOC does or when Gavin Newsom does, for example. So I see that, but I also see that the level of military and intelligence integration is so high. And Trump is still a very consequential, very popular, leader in Israel. The Israelis immediately joined Trump's board of peace when, almost no other American allies did. You've got U.S. support for recognition of the occupied territory, the Golan Heights. It was Trump that moved the embassy to Jerusalem, despite so many other American presidents that had promised that they would. It was Trump that basically wink and a nod on accepting further illegal seizures of West Bank territory. Now, I think that could change a lot with a new administration, more so on the Democratic side than on the Republican side. But I think Tucker Carlson might be running. And he would certainly lean into that heavily. But, you and I both know that the institutional capacity to maintain stickiness of things that make a lot of money for the military industrial complex. But I recognize that the military industrial complex in the US creates jobs in every one of the 435 districts for members of the House, whether it's red or blue. And they spend a lot of money on lobby. And that's even more true when you look at these new AI and technology players on defense, and they are all in on maintaining that relationship with Israel. So I do think that the interests of the so-called uniparty in ensuring that relationship persists is really strong. And I don't know that even a Tucker presidency, as unlikely as that presently seems, though no less likely than a Trump presidency would have been in 2015, would really break that. You
mentioned the Board of Peace, and it just, as you say that, it's striking that, I don't know, it was about 8 months ago, a little more than 8 months ago, that the Gaza plan was announced, that the war ended, and kind of fairly ambitious, expansive set of objectives was laid out in the Trump administration's plan. None of that, or very little of that, has happened, and Gaza seems to be in this kind of purgatory that will persist indefinitely. Do you see any potential movement there, or is that likely?
I think it's like Iran. I think it's, you got phase one of the deal, and you made a big announcement, And then Trump's interests moved on, and phase 2 and phase 3 are much harder, and the Israelis aren't prepared to be supportive. And so he's like, whatever. But I don't think it's a priority. I think the priority is Venezuela, the priority is Cuba, priority is Mexico. He's going to go back to the national security strategy where he's got legitimate wins and where the general, sort of the trajectory and the atmospherics are much, much more positive and favorable for Trump, for Marco, for others, where I think it's really hard to get to this nuclear agreement with the Iranians and the $300 billion deal that would be attendant to that the Gulf states have no idea what it actually is. And the Americans are saying, well, we're not going to pay for it. Well, so it's not just about getting the Iranians to play.
This is the Gulf government supposedly investing $300 billion in Iran for reconstruction and everything else.
Yes. And again, since Trump says no taxpayer money is going to happen, so obviously it's mostly coming from them. And so you've got the Iranians not willing to give the nuclear piece. You got the Gulfies say, we have no idea what the 300 billion is. You got the Israelis with the Lebanon card. None of that looks likely. Same thing is true on Gaza. And I don't understand what the border peace is supposed to do. Again, this was weird. So you and I were at Davos. And of course, the border peace was meant to be a Gaza reconstruction mechanism. And there was a lot of movement. I mean, I remember talking to Larry Fink weeks before Davos and his involvement.
This is the CEO of BlackRock.
Yeah. And I mean, to try to help provide funding for what would eventually be reconstruction for Gaza. And the Gulf states were into it. And Trump had succeeded in getting a Security Council resolution, no vetoes, to support the Gaza peace plan that they had driven back in September. And so, if he had shown up at Davos and just done that, that was a big win. And it would have been some of the biggest news that would have come out at Davos. And instead, Trump decided to go bigger, and he was going to announce a new mechanism that would be a global border peace, where he would be chairman for life. He'd be in charge even after he was no longer president of the United States, and countries would give billions to that to have permanent membership, and Trump would determine where that money would actually go and be used. And of course, the Chinese immediately say, no, we're not joining that. We'd much rather just take over your old role in the United Nations, which is a meaningful organization. So he ends up standing on the stage with Paraguay and Belarus and Albania and Mongolia. And it was meaningless. It was meaningless. And he basically turned a winner into a loser. And one could argue that he did the same thing with Iran. When he had his 12-day war with the Israelis. The Israelis started it. Trump came in, just like he did with Qasem Soleimani. He hit him hard. There was no response against the Americans directly. They were able to push back their enriched uranium program, their processing, right? And he could have done it again. And instead, he's like, no, I'm going to go bigger. And again, Venezuela, so successful for Trump on the ground. He was maximally confident in his ability to turn Iran into a new Venezuela. He was not listening to advisors that were urging caution, whether the head of the Joint Chiefs, Dan Kane, or whether his vice president, J.D. Vance, and instead was like, nope, I'm in charge. I'm the guy. I can make this happen. And as we've seen 4 months later, he has failed wildly. And it's unfortunate. But, look, Trump is the leader of the most powerful country in the world, and he is an extraordinary risk taker. I wouldn't be surprised if he has more success in Cuba than Obama ever did. But he's also had bigger failures than almost anyone. And certainly since the Iraq war under Bush, it's hard to come up with a president that has failed more spectacularly than what we've seen Trump just pull off with Iran. And it's the same president. That's kind of extraordinary.
You note in the piece that China's both the power that's likely to pick up influence in the Middle East in the wake of this war, but also much more broadly, the greatest geopolitical beneficiary of this. How do you think China is playing this moment as you assess Xi Jinping's reaction to Trump this time around? Do you think it's using the moment well or not as well as people might think in this moment?
I'd give them probably like a 6 out of 10, right? So again, I mean, because the Chinese are so risk averse, they really want to take no moves that could lead to regrets, right? It's all no regret moves. It's all incremental. And so they see all of these opportunities and they say, great, great, great. So let's just be very cautious. This would have been a time for the Chinese, if they wanted to take the lead in the Iran peace negotiations. They put that 5-point plan together with Pakistan. They could have nudged the Pakistanis out. They chose not to. They're like, this could go badly. We don't want a part of that. And I mean, certainly Xi Jinping has made it more clear to Putin that he'd like to see a ceasefire, and this war is not going well for the Russians. And we've heard that through Xi's conversations with Trump in Beijing, but also through conversations I've had with senior Chinese leaders since then, since Putin was in Moscow and since Xi Jinping was in Pyongyang. But they're not willing to play a prominent public role. And, they've beaten up on the Japanese and this historic enmity, and they don't like the fact that Takaichi has said some, sort of assertive things about Taiwan and that she's spending more money on the military. But the Japanese, like the South Koreans, are very, very worried that they can't count on the Americans going forward. This would be an opportunity to reach out to Japan and South Korea if you were Xi Jinping. They're not doing that. They're not doing that. They could be much, much more assertive in taking some risk and occupying that space. And they're not doing it. So I would argue that they're playing very cautious, long ball on let's just make sure that we've got our AI investments, we've got our new energy investments. We're becoming the world's first electro state. Our economy's not doing that well. Let's be very careful at home. No structural reforms, not trying to move towards a convertible RMB, no threat to the American dollar as a global reserve. It's all just really incremental. These Americans, they've got new leaders every 4 years. They got elections every 2. They make all these crazy mistakes. We're not going to make big mistakes, but we may not take advantage of very much that's out there. That's the way I would see it. So I think that in the Middle East, China has no real enemies in the Middle East. And remember, they facilitated that Iran-Saudi Arabia breakthrough, and they invited them to Beijing. That was a big deal. Why wouldn't you take more advantage of that going forward now? Why wouldn't you want to be the country that puts the Saudis and the Iranians together after this war? And maybe they will. I don't see them doing that.
The other cause for skepticism, as I see it, when it comes to China's ability to really take advantage of this moment, is the fact that they haven't been able to adjust their domestic economic model at all. That all of this is driven by huge numbers of exports. So if you're sitting in Europe or in parts of Latin America or Sub-Saharan Africa or elsewhere in Asia, this should be a moment when, given U.S. policies, there'd be interest in a better relationship with China. But you're seeing such economic threat that you have a kind of coming trade war between Europe and China, despite every reason why Europe would want to have a better relationship with China. So that, I think, undercuts.
I couldn't agree more. But the only part of the Chinese economy that's really firing is manufacturing export. And they're leaning into it. And you see the trade surpluses are wild and massive. And this is making the Europeans feel much more vulnerable and hit them back. And that is also true with other countries, though. If you're Sub-Saharan Africa, you really don't have a choice, right? So that, and they are engaging more with the Indians. And that's been smart. And that invitation with Shanghai Cooperation Organization and, the reduction of tensions on the border, the efforts to improve cross-border trade, those things have seemed smart to me. But that wasn't being driven by such imbalances in the economic relationship, where with the Europeans it really is. And they would have to be willing to take domestic risk economically. And they weren't. And it reminds me of zero COVID. Xi Jinping was all in on a very, very risk-averse strategy, and he held on to it until it was so obvious that it just wasn't working. It was causing all of these challenges for him. So finally, he just ripped the Band-Aid off. But what was interesting, Dan, and we should remember this, when he ripped the Band-Aid off on zero COVID, I mean, they basically said everyone gets COVID, right? And they did it within like 3 days. You had never seen policy move that quickly at scale. So we should recognize that China's ability to change their tune on policy at a big level could happen quickly, even though it's not right now. I don't feel confident in saying that their focus on just incremental, no structural reforms in their domestic side, which is going to force them to continue with these deeply problematic export policies, that we won't see a sudden change there in a year and 2 years' time. I don't feel confident about that.
What about the middle power approach to this moment? It's requisite in almost any conversation we have at this point to talk about the Mark Carney speech at Davos 6 or so months ago. As you've watched both Canada, but also other middle powers, U.S. allies facing a much different Washington, how do you assess their efforts to shape this moment in a way that protects their interests? I think even Carney has climbed down from some of his more aggressive positions. But
with his New York speech a few weeks ago, and yeah, we can be like great together. And so, Mark, first of all, I think that there have been 3 different speeches that are consequential in that regard on thinking about what's coming next geopolitically. All of them have been kind of subverted by G0 realities. So Mark's was really big, middle powers, big rupture, need a consolidated strategy, can't have a consolidated strategy. So as a consequence, you've got this, sort of variable geometry where different groupings of countries will do more together and they'll hedge more on different issues when they can. Why? Because there's no there in middle power alignment. And everybody is going to go their own way in terms of how they do and don't hedge the Americans and the Chinese. Secondly, you've got the Chinese saying Thucydides' trap. It's all about the United States and China. We need to avoid that. China's rising. America's in decline. We're going to be careful and cautious. But the reality is that the United States isn't declining. It's America's allies that are declining. China's not willing to actually play the kind of role that would be required to make a Thucydides trap come along. And there are lots of other countries that are very consequential. And there are non-country actors that are very consequential, as you and I have talked about, and as I've written a lot about in foreign affairs over the last few years, the technology companies who act as functional sovereigns in the digital space. And then we have Emmanuel Macron and the G7 and talking about these 3 different, sort of economic policies, fiscal policies that are fundamentally imbalanced from the 3 major economic powers, the EU systematically underinvesting, the Americans systematically taking on too much debt, and the Chinese systematically manufacturing too much for export. And that would be a wonderful conversation for all 3 leaders to have, to figure out how those imbalances could be set into balance, none of which are willing to do anything. Not all 3, and not any dyad. You would imagine that this would be a great conversation for the Americans and the Europeans to have together vis-a-vis China. There ain't no way that's happening in this environment. So, it's like 3 really interesting analytic perspectives on what happens in the G0 and what happens as the G0 hits you back in the face. That's kind of where we are.
If you bring in those tech company actors, and this goes back to a piece you wrote, I think in 2021, about the Technopolar moment. We've seen so many kind of interesting dynamics around this over the last several months, whether it's Elon Musk and SpaceX and Starlink, and the way that, decisions about who has access to Starlink terminals can shape wars, the back and forth between Anthropic and the Trump administration on AI models. And I think it was several days ago that the administration very suddenly shut down Anthropic's most recent model because it thought the safety risks were not adequately addressed. How do you read the technopolar dynamic as it's played out in the Trump administration?
You and I saw the G7 and saw those CEOs, the tech CEOs, sitting around the table with the G7 leaders and calling for a US-led AI coalition governance and getting nothing. And absent that, they're writing their own rules. I mean, there couldn't have been a better visual for the technopolar world we're talking about than that. And these technology companies, that AI is coming fast. It's extraordinary in the capabilities. You saw Mark Warner talking about the fact that all of the internal defenses for the NSA and others were broken when they were in an internal usage by Mythos. Sort of we're seeing that, nope, they just found everything and were able to break it. And that's why the Americans had to shut it down. But I mean, how many months are we away from the Chinese having those capabilities? 6 max, right? And it's not just those companies, it's going to be a whole bunch of smaller actors that will be able to start programming these things without enormous amount of scientific capability. So I worry a lot about what happens when the Russians, getting hit deep inside Russia, even in Moscow, by the Ukrainians, and Putin seems to be losing the war. Marco Rubio was saying in the G7 to some Europeans that Putin seems to be the only person out that doesn't realize he's losing the war in Ukraine right now, but he doesn't realize it. And he's not willing to act that way. He's certainly not willing to accept a ceasefire without preconditions, as Zelensky has been willing to. What happens when Putin ultimately, unwilling to listen to his advisors, unwilling to listen to anyone around the world, with 5,000 nuclear weapons, what might he do when pushed against a wall? I mean, I got a note from a world leader this weekend specifically on that. It's like, seeing that a lot of the Europeans are acting like they're scared of the cornered rat, and how should they respond to that? Very interesting, right? I'm very worried about that in the next few years. That is the only purely geopolitical risk that gives me systemic pause. Dan, I can think of 5 risks like that from AI that give me systemic pause in the next 3 years. And certainly the bio threat that comes from people, never mind countries, deploying these AI models. Certainly the lethal autonomous drone swarms being programmed and what that could mean. Certainly the impact of cybersecurity ripping AI models and their impact on critical infrastructure, national security infrastructure, power grids, impact of bot fleets, agent fleets on the functioning of a financial market. I just named 4, right? All of those, in my view, in the next 1 to 3 years, worry me as much as what I see happening from Putin. And they worry me as much because, like with Putin, there ain't no governance mechanism, right? That's the problem. Like, Putin wouldn't be such a risk if there was a governance mechanism, if there were people around him, that you had some checks and balances, you had some rule of law, you had some allies that could talk him off the ledge. I mean, all of that kind of stuff. You don't have any of that with Putin. And you don't have any of that with this AI stuff. Like, this stuff is, the political scientists are not covering it. They don't have models for it. They don't understand it. The leaders in the G7, they have a much better clue on how to handle China, on how to respond to Russia, even when they're going off the rails, than they do in figuring out what to do with AI. We got to spend a lot more time and effort and resources on this.
Can I ask about the governance piece? Because you know the private sector conversations here. You've been involved on the UN side, trying to get at least some nascent effort to create some kind of governance frameworks here. What is not working there? And do you see any hope that those will get traction? Or have you, I don't imagine you have declared defeat on that, but the odds just seem very long that you'll get major progress on governance on a timeline that really matters, given how quickly the models are developing.
I think Sam Altman was right about this a year ago when he said that a crisis is coming. We have to hope that it's, sort of small enough that it doesn't really blow us up. But we have to hope it's big enough that it forces us to move. See, COVID was not a big enough crisis to force us to move. I mean, the US out of the World Health Organization and all this money out of pandemic response just a few years after COVID. And it's because we just didn't take it seriously enough. Like, we can deal with that, right? So I think that on the AI side, given how fast it's moving and given how absent governance is, it's clear that we're going to have crises that will be part of the forcing of the response mechanism. It's not going to be proactive. There are some areas where I see some movement. I see some movement between the Chinese and the Americans. I think that the Chinese are very worried about the biosecurity threat coming from other actors, not US, non-China. I think that the Americans and the Chinese will have the willingness to engage in some of that, and that'll be constructive. And I look forward to seeing that. I think it'll be, track one, and I think it'll be track 1.5, but I think that'll be useful. I think that there'll be some movement from the AI companies to try to do more on the bio side. And maybe the US government, maybe this one, maybe the next one will take it up. Maybe some other countries will too. But I mean, the reality is that this kind of stuff that you and I have been talking about for years, like mechanisms like an AI stability board that would recognize when there are threats that come from AI, that surface and communicate them and immediately get all of the relevant actors together to try to contain it. That we are very, very, the only thing you had close to that was Besant with all the bankers. And then you'd say, why Besant and not also CISA, which would have been on the critical infrastructure side? It's like, well, because critical infrastructure outside finance, the Americans didn't have the talent. Why only the banks? Why not the critical infrastructure companies? Well, because it was Besant. Why not the Canadians? Why not the Europeans? Well, because they didn't care as much about them. None of that works, because AI isn't just about the banks and isn't just about the Americans. I mean, this is systemic stuff. So no, we're not moving quickly in that direction, in my view.
What is the AI version of a Cuban Missile Crisis? If you take the analogy that that's what really drove progress on arms control, non-pro, what's a scenario that you think would focus minds without destroying the world?
I think that any of these sorts of attacks, again, God forbid, I've talked to so many chief security officers about the possibility of like a major drone swarm that kills hundreds or thousands in a stadium, someplace, an open air stadium. I think something like that happening anywhere around the world would make people treat the response on AI and drones seriously, immediately, and put resources towards it. And so think about the equivalence of those in terms of scale in all of the other areas we're talking about. And that's kind of what you're looking at.
The other dimension of the public-private dynamic in the Trump administration that is notable and challenges foreign policy analysis, because it's different than the kinds of factors we usually consider seriously, is, to put it simply, corruption or kleptocracy is, the way we often talk about it. How do you factor that into geopolitical analysis, foreign policy analysis at this moment? And how do you think about the long-term effects of what we've seen in the last year and a half?
So 2 ways. First, obviously, corruption is a long-term problem in the United States. The U.S. has become a coin-operated democracy. Billions of dollars go into its elections, go into its lobbies in ways that are well beyond that of any other advanced industrial economy. So much so that most average Americans are now feeling that they no longer feel like they will have opportunities for themselves because it's a two-tier system. Two-tier justice system, two-tier legal system. Unless you have access to power and can pay for it, system doesn't really work for you. That's how you got Trump. And unfortunately, Trump is not responding to it by fighting it, though that was the drain the swamp idea in his first term. He doesn't talk about that anymore. Instead, he's monetizing it. I don't think you can assess Trump policies, domestically or foreign policy, unless you have as one of your independent variables who is getting paid, right? And that should not be a principal driver of U.S. policy, but it is becoming a more principal driver of U.S. policy. And so I don't see how you can do the assessment unless you have that. But I also recognize that the growth in anti-establishment sentiment in U.S. political system is going to persist. And the fact that Trump's political revolution has failed and has not been true to many of its core promises. It has on border security, but is not on ending all wars. And it certainly is not in draining the swamp or dealing with the Epstein files, for example. There will be other leaders that will be elected to respond to that. So I think that the next political revolution in the US is much more likely to be a legitimate anti-corruption push. And then the question will be, Does that also mean general pitchforks against wealthy people, against oligarchs, against, folks that aren't involved in corruption, but are seen as benefiting illegitimately from a system that is capturable, right, through its legal system? And I would also say that when Trump first became president, I thought there were three characteristics that Trump had that many presidents have had, but he had them to a greater degree than any American president that I had experienced. And the first was an authoritarian impulse, a greater willingness to support systems that did not have checks and balances on the executive and wanting that in the United States. Secondly, a personal support for corruption and kleptocracy. And third, an incompetence when it came to policy. Despite his genius in branding and his political id and his instincts and impulses, but an incompetence when it came to policy. And that of the three, I thought the one that had the greatest impact was the policy incompetence. And I felt that way in 2016. And I think that is even more true in 2026. That his belief that he knows better than everyone else and his willingness to run over, in many cases, quite smart political advisors, not all of them. I mean, some of them are like Hegseth and wildly unfit, but some of them, like Marco Rubio, could be Secretary of State for anyone and would certainly be effective. And Scott Bessent, in my view, and John Ratcliffe, in my view, Dan Kane, certainly, in my view. And yet, Trump does not listen to them with frequency because he knows better. And he doesn't know better. And that leads to extraordinary policy mistakes. Whether you're talking about something wildly inconsequential and stupid, like a reflecting pool, or whether you're talking about something incredibly consequential that matters, like the war in Iran. And that's kind of where I think we are today.
You definitely brought us full circle there, so we could spend another hour on Cuba and Ukraine and Washington and much else, but let's leave it there. Ian, thanks for that.
We'll do it soon, I'm sure, man.
Yeah, the great recent piece, the AI and tech pieces from a couple of years ago are well worth going back to. But for now, thanks so much for doing this.
Dan, great talking to you, man.
Thank you for listening. You can find the articles that we discussed on today's show at foreignaffairs.com. This episode of the Foreign Affairs Interview was produced by Mary-Kate Godfrey and Kanish Tharoor. Our audio engineer is Christopher Cook. Original music is by Robin Hilton. Special thanks as well to Arena Hogan. Make sure you subscribe to the show wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you like what you heard, please take a minute to rate and review it. We release a new show every Thursday. Thanks again for tuning in.